The sun was setting when Alice first saw the music box. She had been browsing through a dusty antique shop on the corner of a forgotten street, its windows smeared with grime, when something caught her eye, a small, ornate wooden box sitting on a shelf, half hidden by shadows. The box was beautiful in a strange, unsettling way. Its dark wood was etched with delicate symbols Alice didn't recognize, and its brass latch gleamed faintly in the dim light. But it was the intricate carvings of figures, tiny, twisted beings, along the edges that sent a chill through her. Interested? The shopkeeper's voice made her jump. He was a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Alice hesitated. "What is it?" "A music box. Very old." His voice was flat, almost disinterested. "Careful, though. It has history." History. The word lingered in the air like a warning, but Alice ignored the growing sense of unease. There was something about the box, something that drew her in like it was calling out to her. "How much?" she asked, already knowing she would buy it. The shopkeeper's lips curled into a faint smile. "For you, a special price." Without thinking, Alice handed him the money and took the box home. That night, as she sat in her dimly lit apartment, she placed the box on her table and opened it. The lid creaked, revealing a delicate mechanism inside. As she turned the small key on the side, a haunting melody filled the room, soft and slow, but oddly dissonant. The music was beautiful, yet unsettling. Each note seemed to hang in the air too long, like it was reaching for something just out of sight. But what was truly disturbing were the carvings inside the lid. Grotesque faces, twisted in agony, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Alice's heart quickened. She snapped the lid shut, but the music didn't stop. It played on, the melody growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the lights in her apartment flickered. A draft, cold and sharp, swept through the room, rattling the windows. The temperature dropped, and Alice felt a creeping sense of dread claw at her spine. She looked around, her breath shallow, expecting to see something, anything, in the shadows. But there was nothing. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. For a long moment, Alice sat frozen, her mind racing. She reached for the box, intending to throw it across the room, but her hand stopped short. The air had changed. It felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't quite place, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then ever so faintly, she heard it. A whisper. Her name. Alice. Her heart pounded in her chest. She shot up from her chair, knocking it over as she scrambled backward. The whisper came again, this time closer, as if someone or something was standing right behind her. "Alice." She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath came in short gasps as she scanned the shadows, her eyes darting to every corner. There was nothing, no one, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, remained. Alice's gaze fell back to the music box. Its lid was closed, the key still in place. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for it again. Her hand trembled as she touched the cool wood, but nothing happened. The box was silent, still. Shaken, Alice stepped back, her mind racing with questions. What had she just heard? Was it her imagination? A trick of the mind, spurred by the eerie music? But deep down, she knew the truth. The music box wasn't just an antique. It was something more, something ancient, something wrong. She should have left it at the shop. But now it was too late. The curse had already begun. For the next few days, Alice tried to ignore the strange feeling that lingered in her apartment. She went about her daily routine, keeping the music box shoved in the back of her closet, hoping to forget about it. But the sense of being watched never left her. It clung to her like a second skin, a constant weight pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't long before the whispers began again. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the city outside her window. A single word, repeated in the dead of night, Alice. She told herself it was a dream, a fragment of her imagination twisting in the darkness. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they followed her even in the daylight. One morning, as she brewed her coffee, she heard it clearly, a low, rasping voice, speaking directly in her ear. Alice! The mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Heart pounding, she spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her. But once again, there was nothing. Just the empty kitchen and the cold air that seemed to seep in from every corner. She didn't know where to turn. It wasn't something she could explain, wasn't something she could call the police about. How could she tell anyone about the voice, the shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking, or the feeling of icy fingers brushing the back of her neck? She tried to distract herself, diving into work, spending long hours at the office to avoid being home alone. But even there, the whispers found her. In the quiet moments, when the office was nearly empty, she would hear her name, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the hallways or creeping in from the ventilation shafts. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alice returned home, exhausted but wary. She hesitated at the door, the weight of the key in her hand suddenly too heavy. Something inside felt different, like the air had thickened, grown darker in her absence. As she stepped into the apartment, the feeling hit her all at once, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if she was not alone. The lights flickered the moment she crossed the threshold, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. And then she saw it. In the dim light, at the far end of the hallway, a figure stood, barely visible but unmistakable. It was tall, its form shrouded in darkness, the edges of its silhouette shifting like smoke. Its head tilted toward her, and though its face was hidden, Alice felt its gaze burrowing into her. She couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Alice stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the light switch. The overhead light flickered back on, bright and harsh, but the figure had vanished. She stood there, trembling, her mind struggling to process what she had just seen. It was real. It had been right there. Her eyes darted to the closet where she had hidden the music box. Without thinking, she crossed the room and yanked open the door, her hands shaking as she pulled the box from the shelf. The carvings on its surface seemed darker now, the figures more grotesque, as if they had shifted in her absence. Their hollow eyes seemed to watch her, accusing. The moment her fingers touched the lid, the melody began to play. She hadn't wound it. She hadn't touched the key. The music was slow, dragging, each note sending a chill through her bones. Her hand jerked back, but the lid creaked open on its own, revealing the spinning mechanism inside. The tiny ballerina that had once twirled gracefully was now still, her delicate face cracked, her arms twisted at unnatural angles. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. Alice screamed, her hands blindly searching for her phone, her mind racing. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had turned to black fog. And then she heard it again, the whisper. Only this time it was closer. So close, she could feel the cold breath on her neck. Alice! A flash of movement in the corner of her eye made her turn, but the darkness swallowed everything. She stumbled backward, knocking into furniture as the whisper turned into a low growl, rumbling through the room like a distant storm. Her vision swam, panic clawing at her throat. She needed to get out. She needed to escape, but every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into the shadows. And then, with a sickening jolt, the lights snapped back on. The room was empty, silent. The music had stopped. The shadows were gone. But Alice knew, deep in her bones, that something had followed her out of the darkness. And it wasn't going to leave. Alice barely slept that night. She sat in her living room, every light in the apartment blazing, clutching her phone in one hand and a knife in the other. But as the hours dragged on, the apartment remained eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional hum of passing cars outside. By dawn, she felt delirious from exhaustion, her mind swimming with questions. What was happening? What had she unleashed? The next day, she went back to the antique shop, desperate for answers. She rushed through the narrow aisles, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But when she reached the back of the store where she had found the music box, her heart sank. The shop was empty. Dust coated the shelves, and the lights inside flickered dimly, as if the place had been abandoned for years. The shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. She called out, her voice trembling, but the only answer was the echo of her own words. The door behind her creaked closed, and the soft jingle of a bell sent a chill through her. In the silence, she could almost hear it again, that faint, distant whisper, like something ancient stirring beneath the surface of the world. Alice backed out of the shop, her head spinning. She tried to tell herself it was all a mistake, that she had come to the wrong place. But deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong, something far worse than she could have ever imagined. That evening, the whispers came again, but this time, they didn't stop. Every corner of her apartment felt alive with their murmurs, calling her name over and over, like a chorus of voices just beyond the veil of reality. Shadows began to move on their own, creeping along the walls, twisting in unnatural shapes. She tried to drown it out, playing music, leaving the television on, but nothing worked. The whispers grew louder, angrier, and with them came other things. It started small. Objects would shift when she wasn't looking. Her keys would disappear, only to reappear in strange places, like the freezer or beneath her pillow. Lights would flicker, and appliances would turn on by themselves. But soon, the disturbances grew violent. One night, as Alice lay in bed, she heard a soft scraping sound. Her heart pounded as she sat up, the room eerily still. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. It was coming from inside the walls. She pressed her ear against the plaster, and the moment she did, the sound exploded, a cacophony of scratching and pounding, as if something was trying to claw its way out. She stumbled back, heart racing, and that's when she saw it. Her reflection in the mirror across the room was wrong. It was still her face, but something about it was twisted. Her eyes were darker, hollow, her mouth twisted into a crooked grin that didn't belong to her. Frozen in place, Alice watched in horror as her reflection began to move on its own, lifting a hand to wave mockingly at her. She screamed, shattering the moment as she grabbed the nearest object and hurled it at the mirror. The glass exploded in a shower of shards, and in the instant the reflection vanished, the pounding in the walls stopped. For a brief moment, the apartment was silent again, but it was a false peace. As Alice tried to catch her breath, something cold brushed against her ankle. She looked down, her blood running cold. There, just beneath the bed, pale fingers curled out from the shadows, reaching toward her. With a cry, Alice leaped back, crashing into the dresser as the fingers slithered further into the light. A figure crawled out from under the bed, distorted, with long limbs and a grotesque, gaunt face twisted into a permanent scream. Its eyes, dark and sunken, locked onto hers as it dragged itself toward her, its bony fingers scraping the floor. Panicking, Alice scrambled to her feet and ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She stood in the hallway, heart pounding, chest heaving. But when she turned around, the creature was gone. The apartment was silent again, but she could still feel it, watching, waiting. She had barely escaped, but she knew it wasn't over. The music box was still there somewhere in the apartment, and with it the curse. That night, Alice sat in her kitchen, staring at the music box she had placed on the table in front of her. She had to get rid of it. She knew that much, but a gnawing fear had taken root in her mind. What if it was already too late? What if the curse had latched onto her, following her wherever she went? Desperation clawed at her. She grabbed the box and rushed out into the night, her breath misting in the cold air as she ran through the empty streets. She knew what she had to do: destroy it, burn it, bury it, anything to sever the connection. She found herself at the edge of the park, an old stone bridge looming in front of her. Without hesitation, she hurled the music box over the side, watching it disappear into the dark waters below. But as it sank, the melody began to play once more, faint and distorted, rising from the depths like a ghostly echo. The air around her grew cold, and for the first time, she felt it, truly felt it, The presence that had been haunting her wasn't in the box. It was in her, and it wasn't going to let her go. Alice stood frozen on the bridge, her breath turning to mist in the cold night air. The melody from the music box continued to echo faintly, growing fainter by the second, as if it were being swallowed by the darkness beneath the water. But the haunting tune still lingered in her mind, looping endlessly, wrapping around her thoughts like a noose. She wanted to believe it was over, that by throwing the music box away, she had rid herself of the curse. But deep down, she knew better. The presence clung to her, heavy and suffocating, like a shadow that stretched across her soul. Even with the music box gone, the air felt charged, crackling with malevolence. As she stood there, trembling in the night, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Alice's head snapped up, her heart racing. Someone was approaching, slowly, deliberately, from the other side of the bridge. The figure was obscured by the shadows, but as it drew closer, Alice's stomach twisted with dread. The person moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking with every step, like a marionette on tangled strings. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure came into view. It was the shopkeeper. His face was gaunt, his skin paper-thin and stretched tightly over his skull. His eyes, once hollow and disinterested, were now wide and glassy, staring directly at her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. He wore the same grimy clothes, his bony hands clasped together as if in prayer. "You can't get rid of it, Alice," he said, his voice dry and brittle, as if the words were scraping through his throat. "It's yours now, forever." Alice stumbled back, shaking her head. No, I got rid of it. It's gone." The shopkeeper smiled, his cracked lips peeling back over yellowed teeth. "It doesn't matter. The music box was only the beginning. You let it in. Now, it follows you." Before Alice could respond, the lights on the bridge flickered, plunging her into near darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and the world around her seemed to constrict, like the shadows themselves were closing in. She turned to run, her feet pounding against the pavement. But as she fled, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping, a cacophony of voices calling her name from all directions. "Alice." Her breath came in short gasps, her vision blurring as she sprinted through the empty streets. No matter how fast she ran, the whispers followed, growing closer, more insistent. The streetlights above her flickered out one by one as she passed, leaving her in complete darkness. Panic clawed at her throat. She could feel it, something behind her, something closing in. A presence, a shadow that moved with her, feeding off her fear. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of her apartment building and pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exhaustion. As she reached the door, she fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. Finally, she managed to shove the door open and slammed it behind her, locking it with trembling hands. She leaned against the door, gasping for breath, her heart thundering in her chest. For a moment, she thought she was safe. But then the apartment grew still, unnaturally still. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. It pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, as if the very air was alive, watching, waiting. Then came the sound she dreaded most, a slow, deliberate creak. Alice turned, her stomach lurching with horror. The closet door in the hallway was opening on its own. The door swung inward, revealing the darkness inside. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was the figure she had seen before, the gaunt, twisted creature, its sunken eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It smiled at her, a grotesque grin that stretched too wide for its face, and took a step forward, dragging its long, skeletal fingers along the floor. Alice backed away, her throat tight with terror. She knew there was no escaping it now. Whatever she had unleashed was inside her home, inside her life. The lights in the apartment flickered violently, and the figure took another step toward her, its head tilting unnaturally as if it was studying her. The shadows around it seemed to pulse and writhe, as though they were alive. Alice stumbled into the kitchen, her mind racing. She grabbed a knife from the counter, clutching it tightly in her trembling hands. But what could she do? How could she fight something that wasn't human? The figure stopped at the edge of the hallway, its blackened eyes fixed on hers. For a moment, they stared at each other in the stifling silence. And then it spoke. In a voice that sounded like the scraping of bones against stone, it whispered, "There's no escape, Alice. You belong to it now. To us." Alice's hands shook, her grip tightening around the knife. "What do you want from me?" she choked out. The creature's smile widened, and the air around it seemed to ripple with a sickening energy. Everything. Without warning, the creature lunged toward her, moving faster than anything she had ever seen. Alice screamed and swung the knife wildly, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The cold, slimy touch of its fingers brushed against her skin, sending a wave of nausea through her. She stumbled back, crashing into the kitchen table. The creature loomed over her, its eyes gleaming with hunger, and for the briefest moment, Alice thought this was it, that the darkness would consume her. But then, something unexpected happened. The music box. The haunting melody began to play again, faint at first, but growing louder, stronger. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, as if the very walls were singing. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing, its smile fading. The music seemed to disorient it, making it recoil as though in pain. For the first time, it looked afraid. Alice, seizing the moment, ran from the kitchen and darted toward the front door. The whispers rose again, but they were different now, panicked, furious. She could hear the creature thrashing behind her, its voice turning into a guttural snarl. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and threw it open. But as she stepped outside, she realized the curse had taken its toll. The shadows had followed her into the world beyond. The music continued to play, echoing in her mind as the darkness crept closer. No matter where she went, the curse would follow. It was inside her now. Alice stumbled out of her apartment and into the cold night, her breath ragged, her mind spinning. She could still hear the melody of the music box, distant but ever present, like it was buried deep inside her skull. The street around her seemed unnaturally still, every sound muted, every shadow stretched and distorted, as if the world itself had warped under the curse's influence. Her legs felt weak, her body exhausted from nights of terror and no sleep, but she kept moving. She didn't know where she was going. There was nowhere to go. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step she took, overlapping into a maddening cacophony of voices. They weren't just whispering her name anymore. They were saying other things, things she didn't understand, ancient words that made her skin crawl, like a chant from something far older than time itself. She could feel it, the presence, always just behind her, lingering in the corner of her vision, but whenever she turned, it was gone. She was trapped, hunted by something she couldn't fight, couldn't reason with. As she reached the edge of the park, she collapsed onto a bench, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her heart pounded, and the cold air burned her lungs, but the music still played, and the whispers continued their relentless assault. Alice clutched her head, trying to drown out the sounds, but they only grew louder. "Alice," the voices hissed. "You can't escape. You never could." Tears filled her eyes. She didn't want to live like this, constantly running, constantly afraid. She couldn't. But the presence, the curse, it was everywhere now. It had seeped into every part of her life. Even here, outside the apartment, she felt the suffocating darkness closing in, tightening around her like a vice. Through the blur of her tears, Alice looked up and saw something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, beneath the street lamp, stood the figure, the creature, staring at her. Its long limbs were bent at odd angles, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, watching her with those hollow, black eyes. The smile was back, wider now, stretching grotesquely across its face, as if it was savoring her terror. But it wasn't alone this time. Behind it, more figures began to appear, slipping out of the shadows. Each one was twisted and unnatural, their eyes empty voids, their faces frozen in expressions of torment. They moved slowly, deliberately, their feet dragging across the ground as they formed a circle around her. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, panic rising like a flood. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was trapped, surrounded. The figures closed in, their distorted forms swaying like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The whispers became deafening, a chorus of voices screaming inside her mind. "We see you, Alice. We're always with you." In her desperation, she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, but it did nothing to stop the figures. They moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their hands reaching out for her, skeletal fingers curling toward her skin. Alice scrambled off the bench, her hands shaking as she reached for something, anything, to defend herself. But there was nothing. She was alone, defenseless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A glint of metal, a shovel, half buried in the dirt beside an old tree. Without thinking, she lunged for it, her hands closing around the wooden handle. As the figures drew closer, she swung the shovel wildly, the weight of it nearly knocking her off balance. She didn't care. She swung again and again, the metal slicing through the air, but the figures didn't flinch. They weren't real, not in the way she understood. They were shadows, phantoms, part of the curse that had latched onto her soul. And no matter how much she swung, she couldn't fight them off. But then, something strange happened. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Alice froze, the shovel slipping from her hands as she felt the earth shake. The figures around her stopped too, their hollow eyes locking onto her, as if they were waiting for something. The trembling grew stronger, more violent, and Alice fell to her knees as the ground beneath her split open. From the cracks, a thick, black mist began to rise, swirling around her, cold and oily, filling the air with a stench of rot and decay. The figures moved closer, their twisted forms blending into the mist, becoming part of it. And then, from the very center of the darkness, a new figure emerged, taller, darker, more malevolent than the others. Its face was obscured, its body shrouded in shadows that writhed like living things. Alice's breath caught in her throat as the figure raised a hand, long, thin fingers pointing directly at her. The whispers ceased, replaced by a single voice, deep, ancient, and filled with malice. "You are mine now." Alice tried to move, tried to scream, but the mist had wrapped around her, cold and suffocating. It pulled at her, dragging her toward the figure, toward the blackness. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, everything went silent. The world around her dissolved into nothingness. No sound, no light, just an endless void. But then, slowly, the music returned. The haunting melody of the music box, faint at first, but growing louder, until it consumed everything. And then, Alice opened her eyes. She was back in her apartment. The lights were off, the room bathed in shadows. The music box sat on the table, its lid open, the tiny ballerina twirling slowly to the eerie tune. For a brief moment, Alice thought it had all been a dream, a horrible, twisted nightmare. But as she reached out to touch the music box, she felt it. The darkness. It was still inside her. The curse hadn't left. It had just begun. The whisper came again, soft and close. "Alice." She smiled faintly, her eyes dark, hollow. There was no escape. There never had been. And now, she belonged to the darkness. Forever.